Well, hello everyone and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Lebanon is still reeling from last week's explosion that ripped through the capital, killing over 200 people, injuring thousands and leaving several 100,000 people homeless. The government has since resigned amid anger at what has long been seen as a corrupt and deeply divided sectarian system. It's this system that is widely blamed for the failings that led to the explosion caused by the fertilizer impounded in Beirut port. Today we have Nicholas Blanford, a senior non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council, and the Lebanese journalist Leena Saidi. Both are our experts in Lebanon, and many of you watching will have traveled with them on tour. We're here to learn what happened last week, but also to see if there's any hope that Lebanon's broken political system can be fixed. There's a lot to discuss here, but first I'd like to start talking with both of you about you and your families and also how the blast affected you. And I know that at the time of the explosion, Nick, you were up on the hill, so you were sort of safe and a bit more removed, but Leena, you were in the city centre. So can you just say where you were when it actually happened?
I was actually in Ashrafiyeh, just about a kilometre up from Jemaisi, so maybe like 2 kilometers from the port, from the actual explosion. I was visiting a fellow journalist, a colleague of mine, and I wasn't actually visiting. I just popped by to say hello and drop off something. And we stood and we had a chat. It was a normal day. You know, Lebanon had been on COVID lockdown. So we had 5 days of lockdown and we were having sort of 2 days off before we go into a second lockdown. So I left the house, said bye. She lives in an old building, so she has an iron gate, which you go out of. I stepped out of the iron gate, and you go down some steps to go to the main road. And before the steps, there's like a little opening that you have to cross. So I was crossing an opening, and I heard this like roar. And I didn't know what it was, but instinctively I stepped back so that I was shaded by the building. My back was to the iron gate. And immediately there was this massive, massive explosion that took me back to the gate. And when I looked forward, I just sort of looked forward, the whole of the ground and the steps were covered in glass, bits of door, bits of window frame, bits of iron. I mean, I was so lucky. It's incredible. And immediately then I thought, oh my God, Sarah, turned round and I was calling her name, and her front door was open, and there was this like smog of dust. And I thought, she's gone. And I called again, and then she called my name. And as the dust was settling, I could see that both sides of her room had fallen inwards from the blast. And she looked at me and she thought I was wounded because, of course, we were all covered in this dust and God knows what. And I thought she was wounded, and we could not believe that all she had, they were actually very deep, but it was a few cuts on her leg. So we immediately went, who else? And then the neighbors started running down the stairs. And then I remembered my driver was outside. So we went down to check down the steps, and he had just gone out of the car, I think to have a cigarette, and stones from the building near him, like a balcony, had fallen onto the car. So my story is, one of thousands of the same. I mean, we see each other and we go, you're okay, you're okay. Alhamdulillah, we're okay, we're lucky. I mean, it's strange. I mean, had Beirut been a normal day, had it been a different time, 6 o'clock was when most people had left their offices by 5:30. Also, as I said, Beirut was a bit of a ghost town. It's summer, most people are out of the city. Those that weren't out of the city because of COVID had gone out of the city.
It could have been so much worse.
I
And so
mean,
the driver was okay, you were okay, your friend was okay, but we know lots of people are in that
there
area.
were bodies. There were bodies on the street.
Yeah,
It was that bad. I
yeah.
mean, it was incredible. I mean, we have like, I think the death toll is expected to be around 220.
Mm.
It would have been 22,000 easily.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Jamaica is that nightlife area,
Yeah,
that area full of people going and coming and
yeah.
incredible.
Let's bring up, I know, Nick, you were in the mountains at the time. In the moment, we're going to talk about the politics of this in a second and what's behind all of this, but I think it's important to look at the damage and the impact it's actually had, because it's significant material damage, and that is going to affect the lives of people within Beirut and Lebanon. But let's just bring up some slides here, because this is Nick's apartment. You were aware at the time, but this is what greeted when you got home.
Yes, exactly. I left Beirut around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the day to head up to the mountains. We have a chalet up in the mountains, about 14 miles, 20 odd kilometers east of Beirut. So I was up there at the time. I was in the car with my wife and son. We were going to pick up a bicycle for my daughter from a nearby village. As we entered the village, we heard this thunderclap. It was loud enough to make me flinch, and this is 14 miles away. We thought initially some children had let off a loud firework around the corner, but then as we drove through the village, we saw people coming out of their homes and scanning the skies. And when we parked up, I heard a woman talking about an explosion in Beirut. I thought, well, it can't possibly be the same thing that we just heard, and of course it was. And then when we realized the extent of the blast, we headed straight back to Beirut, dropped the children off with their grandmother, and headed to our home. We are exactly 1 kilometer from ground zero, and we're on the 7th floor of an 8-story building, and there's a bit of space between us and the next building, which is the Greek Orthodox Hospital, which is the direction the blast came. So we got heavily hit. All the glass, just about all the glass is blown out of the windows, door frames blown off, including inside the apartment. This is the sitting room. Those 2 white doors are roughly where I was standing to take the picture. So they had glass windows in. They were blown across the room. The red chair is usually at the other side of the room. That got blown across the room. The second red chair on the left, which is partially hidden by one of the white doors, is where I usually sit. And by the light switch on the wall was studded with glass shards that had been blown across and stuck in the wall. My office, where I probably would have been sitting at 6:05, this room obviously was very badly damaged, and the glass there is rather heavy, double glazing, and that blasted right across the room. So we were extremely lucky that we weren't in the apartment at the time, because it would have been.
Let's look at some of the other slides there. We go forward a bit, because that's the balcony as well.
This is the glassed-in balcony, which is facing the Greek Orthodox Hospital. It bore the brunt of the blast, which came roughly from the left-hand side of the picture. So extensive damage.
Right. Let's go on to go through. That's inside the office.
That's what's left of my office. Now all cleaned up. We've put plastic sheeting on some of the windows.
Yeah. And for those of you who've travelled with us to Beirut, let's just get a scale of this. So we've just taken a Google map here, and if you see that red blob in the middle, that's the Smallville Hotel, which we've stayed in, and that's 4 kilometers from if we take the arrow straight up, directly above to that little, that's it, just that slightly to the right a bit, below a bit. That's where the blast took place, that little bit pointing out in the middle. That's where the grain silos are, that's where the boat was, that's where the center of explosion was. And the distance from there to the Smallville is about 4 kilometers. So if you may have seen video online of the blast coming up through the lifts, coming up through the windows. So it does give you an idea of how far out the damage went. It really is significant. Can Nick, is it possible to assess at the moment in terms of material needs? I presume the port has been damaged, those grain silos have been damaged. There's a huge sort of clear-up operation going on. Do we know the sort of cost and the impact of this blast?
Well, the President, Michel Aoun, apparently said the other day that the estimated cost of damage is around $15 billion. Now, part of the port was very badly damaged, obviously, but other parts of the port are still functioning. So it is still possible to bring in goods, but a lot of the traffic, the sea traffic, is being diverted to Tripoli up in North Lebanon, which has a fully functioning, or pretty much fully functioning, port. So they're going to take some of the load off of Beirut's hands for the time being. In terms of the repair work, it's, I mean, we in our apartment have been one of tens of thousands of families that have been sweeping up glass for the last week. I'm out on the balcony at the moment because I can't sit inside. We can't use the AC because there's no windows. And of course, it's very hot and humid in the middle of August in Beirut, so it's quite unpleasant. But the noise I hear around me are saws, jackhammers, nails being banged into walls. A few days ago, it was the sound of glass being swept up or glass being broken in windows. One of the very impressive things is that the Lebanese are very good when it comes to coping with these kind of disasters. And we've had groups of young Lebanese, we had 2 groups coming to our apartment, banging on the door, offering their help. And we said, thank you very much. Yes, we'd love to have your help. And they came in bustling with brooms and spades and shovels and helped us clear up the debris. And then they moved on to the next floor in our building. So this has been, we haven't seen much of the government, a government response. In fact, the politicians have generally stayed away from the stricken areas because I think one minister did try to go to Jemezi, one of the very heavily hit areas, and she got chased out by an angry crowd. So the politicians have stayed away, and it's really been the local and international NGOs and private citizens, volunteers that have helped to deal with the crisis.
Yeah, so the Lebanese being showing how resilient they are. Leena, I think you've been putting people up in your apartment as well.
Yes, I mean, we've, it happened on a day, as journalists, obviously we have to report. And I would say like half the foreign press here lost their apartments in that explosion because that's the sort of area where a lot of the foreign press do live. Yeah. So on the first night, a whole group, I think we were about 7 of us, came and stayed over at my apartment. We turned the living room into a newsroom, and the newsroom is still functioning up to now. I still have a couple of guests. Other people have been able to go to hotels or to go to other friends' houses. Yeah. But you know how we don't like to divide the city into East and West, but West Beirut is relatively okay. A lot of glass damage, but hotels are still functioning. But on East Beirut, there's no hotels, no cafes, no nothing. So that's why a lot of people have moved on to the west side of the city. But I want to also say that, like Nick said, the Lebanese have been amazing. The amount of people on the streets, the amount of volunteers sweeping, cleaning, even volunteer engineers going to the houses to see if they're structurally safe, people collecting clothes and furniture. And the other day I was at the base camp, which has a lot of volunteers from doing different things. People were giving away fridges and like sofas and lots of clothes and baby food. And it's incredible, really. It's a sight to see.
Well, we're very grateful to have you both here. Leena, we've actually borrowed you. You're on assignment today for another news company. And so I know in a second you've got to go off and do your job, but we're very grateful to have you here with us. I think that most people listening probably have some awareness of the cause of this explosion. It was a very, very large container ship that had unloaded fertilizer destined for Mozambique. It was, I don't know what was it 3,000 tons of it? It was a huge amount. No, maybe it was tons of it anyway. And it was destined to be turned into explosives in Mozambique, and that it was impounded at the port. and then the court authorities and the government essentially do nothing about it for several years. That's cutting a long story short. Nick, what I'd like to do is step back a bit. People are understandably furious that this explosion could have taken place, that things weren't dealt with properly. But it reflects a broader anger against a political system that is seen to have failed. And I'd like you to talk briefly about some of the protest movement that has taken place over the past couple of years. And then we can start delving into what is the source of this politically broken system. So Nick, just talk briefly about the protests.
Yes, so the protest movement began in October last year. Lebanon has been experiencing an economic decline for a number of years, and it began to accelerate in the latter half of last year. And the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to slap a tax on the use of WhatsApp, which is very popular over here. Everyone uses WhatsApp rather than the regular line. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And so people came out in protest, and it very quickly accelerated. So this was essentially Lebanese, apolitical Lebanese, fed up with the venal and corrupt political leadership of the country. And we had mass demonstrations, not just in central Beirut, which is the usual locus of these kind of protests, but it was across the country, particularly up in Tripoli in the north, but also areas in South Lebanon, people coming out and protesting against Hezbollah and the Amal movement, which is another powerful Shia political party here, allied to Hezbollah. And this continued into December. In December, the government resigned, and then we had a new government formed mainly of unknown technocrats in January. But very little else actually happened. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, which kind of shut everything down. So Lebanon went into lockdown from the end of February, and the protests kind of withered with it, but not people's anger. Now, since then, the economic situation has deteriorated. The Lebanese lira, which was trading since 1997 at 1,500 lira to the US dollar, has collapsed. The black market rates are anything between 7,000 and 9,000 lira to the dollar now. So prices have skyrocketed. Businesses are closing, restaurants are shuttering, hotels are closing. Le Gray Hotel, which is a very popular hotel in downtown Beirut, closed down last week. Unemployment is around 40 to 50% at the moment, and it's going to get worse. So things are very, very gloomy. And then, of course, we have this massive explosion. The root causes of the explosion, what actually triggered the blast, remains to be seen. But at the moment, it looks like an accident. But it's an accident due to criminal neglect and incompetence by the Lebanese authorities that allowed this highly explosive material to fester in very unsafe conditions for 7 years.
Yeah, let's. We've got a couple of slides. We're going to get now into what I think is necessary. We have to look at the sort of constitutional structures that enable this sectarian divide within Lebanon and essentially produce a government that doesn't govern. So this dates back. Lebanon's constitution allocates key positions according to your religious background, and voting throughout the country. Generally for a very long time has been along religious lines. And this feeds into a politics of inaction. Nick, can you just sort of run over that? I mean, this has roots that goes back to the sort of French colonization, but was basically reinforced after the Civil War.
Yes, so the political system here was essentially an unwritten agreement between mainly between the sort of Sunni leadership and the Maronite Catholic leadership. Back in the 1940s, Lebanon gained independence from the French mandate in 1943. And this essentially divided the country, split the civil service and political positions along sectarian lines. So, I mean, the most famous one, I suppose, is that the presidency is always a Maronite. The prime minister, the premiership, is allocated to the Sunnis, and the parliamentary speaker is always a Shia. After the Civil War, ended in 1990 under an agreement known as the Ta'if Agreement. They readjusted it slightly to reduce some of the powers of the Maronite president and to have an equal balance in parliament. So you have 50%, as you see in your diagram there, 50% for Muslims, 50% for Christians. Now, the problem with all this is that it breeds incompetence. It means that you don't always get the best candidate for the right job because you have to allocate according to sectarian lines. And it also breeds a system of consensus. You have to have consensus in just about every decision you make, and that's often very difficult to achieve. And really, it boils down to things not getting done. And the case in point is 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate sitting at Beirut port. The port authorities, reportedly, they sent letters to judges requesting, advice on what to do with it. Can we export it somewhere? Can we sell it? And they claim that they never heard back from the judges. I think there's a suspicion as well that some people were thinking how much money they can make out of this. Who's going to get the money from selling the ammonium nitrate? And of course, it ended up blowing up and destroying half the city. So this is a system that the many Lebanese are trying to overturn. We have the same kind of politicians. Many of them were warlords in the civil war, and they swapped their military fatigues for suits.
Let's bring up the next slide. Let's bring up the next slide. So maybe Leena, you could. I don't know how people have got their screen arranged with Zoom, but you can, if you can move the pictures of all of us up or away, you should be able to see the array of 10 people here. Leena, just go through some of the characters here. Some of these characters have been around for a very long time, haven't they?
Yes. The first character with the white flag with the cedar is Samir Jaja, and he's the head of the Lebanese forces. The second person is Saad Hariri, whose father, Rafiq Hariri, was the prime minister that was assassinated. He's the head of a Future movement, which is a Sunni movement. And he was also part of making sure that Ta'if, the accord that happened, that you saw brought the division in the slide you just saw happen. We have Gibran Bassil, who is the head of the FPM. It's mainly the president's movement. He was the Michel Aoun, who
I'm just going to interject here because maybe we don't have time to look all of them. But on the
I was just going to go to the top
from the right, there's Walid Jumblat. I mean, he's been around since the 1970s. Leader throughout the civil war. Then just above him, the head of the Amal movement, who we've met, the Speaker of the Parliament, whose name just escapes me.
Nabi Berri.
Nabi Berri, of course, and Hassan Nasrallah, and that's the sort of obviously the thing the sort of preeminent power within Lebanon really is Hezbollah. I think it's the sense of stasis, Nick, isn't it? But with Hezbollah behind it, in which it's not possible really to make, it's not possible to govern, not possible to make good political decisions.
Well, I think part of the problem is that many of these faces you see in front of you have been in power or heading their parties for a long, long time. And these are the folks that many Lebanese want to see gone. It's not really about the governments, it's about the party political leaders, such as these characters. They have their grips on the lever of power. It allows them to plunder the state coffers, which they use to feed their patronage networks, so that they keep their sort of popularity, grassroots popularity, and also keeps them rich as well. And these are the folks that are obstructing reform. So at the moment, the international community is very willing to help Lebanon, but they're saying, look, before we start unlocking our coffers and handing out cash to you guys, you really need to implement some structural economic and fiscal reforms, eradicate corruption, have accountability, transparency, the sort of things you normally would want in a country. Now, they've been urging the Lebanese authorities to implement these reforms going back a number of years. Back in April 2018, $11.5 billion of financial assistance was pledged to Lebanon in a conference in Paris. But the premise was that before we release the funds, you've got to start the reform process. The reforms have not started in that time. Right now, the government has been talking with the IMF about a financial assistance package, and the talks are going nowhere because there is simply no leverage for the government, which resigned on Monday, to be able to implement reforms against the wishes of these characters you see in front of you. So the prognosis is that if we're not going to have reforms, then we're not going to have international assistance to bail the country out of its economic woes, which means Lebanon is going to continue its long, slow, agonizing slide into the abyss.
Leena, I just want to ask you, when we meet young people in Beirut, and we've certainly seen this on the TV interviews very recently since the explosion, there's this enormous sense of frustration and anger and a desire to create a new kind of politics that is based on issues rather than religious allegiances or sort of patriarchal allegiances. But when you move away from Beirut, and I remember when we went down to Sur, Tyre and the south, it's a very different picture, isn't it? You've still got people of one religious group living in one area. And whilst we might think that the Beirutis are very enlightened, it might be a different thing when you get away from those young people living in Beirut.
Yes, true. I mean, like you said, you know, the young people of Beirut, everybody in Beirut, all the people that you see on your screens now, they have a saying that says in Arabic, kullun yani kullun, which means all of them. They want to get rid of all of them. It's the political elite. They're not going to accept anything less. And yesterday when David Hale came and he was walking around, the young people put up, scribbled on pieces of paper, "Don't bail them out." And that's the feeling. And
if you were to go somewhere like Nabatea in the south, Nabatea, a Shia town, not too far from the border with Israel, what are people's allegiances going to be there? How are they going to think?
Well, Lebanon has different areas with different religions, and that's how people live. And yes, their allegiances do tend to be more like pro-Hezbollah, pro-Lebanese forces in the Christian areas. But throughout the year, it's almost been a year in October, we have seen people from the different areas. In Nabatea, there is an area where people have been demonstrating against the government. The problem is that on the streets, when they have slogans against a specific person, then the people of that party are afraid to come out on the streets and participate, even though they might themselves feel like, you know, I think it's time. Yeah. But then they won't, because the slogans are not unifying. The slogans are actually polarizing.
Right. I think this is, you know, fascinating. I mean, we're at a critical point here. I'd love to get people's questions, and if you can start putting questions into the Q&A box here. Nick, is this a tipping point? Do you get a sense that things finally will change, or are we just going to see more of the same, one crisis to another?
I've just written an article which I think is going up on the Atlantic Council website later on today in Washington, comparing the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005, which Leena just referenced, to the explosion last week. The Hariri assassination in 2005 was a genuine turning point in Lebanese politics, and we're still experiencing the reverberations of that assassination today. A lot of people are asking, is the Beirut explosion, August the 4th, another turning point for Lebanon? I have to say, unfortunately, I'm rather skeptical that it will be. The anger and the rage of the Lebanese towards the authorities is palpable, and this is what led to the government stepping down. Now the negotiations have begun to find the identity of the next prime minister, and then once that happened, the prime minister designate will then start debating about who's going to fill what cabinet seats. At the moment, the front runner for the premiership is Saad Hariri, who resigned back in December when at the height of the protest movements. Saad Hariri, of course, is the son of Rafiq Hariri, as Leena pointed out. So if he is designated prime minister again. That will be his third time as premier since 2009, just two times short of his father's 5 times record as prime minister. And that really does not signal, that things are going to change. To be honest, I'm not really sure what it would take to change the system here beyond mass protests nationwide, plus very stiff international pressure on the leadership. And it's not really about the governments, it's about those party political leaders that we were looking at a few minutes ago. These guys are the problem.
Yeah, let's start bringing in some people now. We've got Lynn Maddock, who's got a good question. So we'll bring Lynn up. And just while we're bringing Lynn up and getting her microphone on, Nick, just to reinforce the last point you were making, this really means tearing up the constitution, doesn't it? And is that really possible? I mean, tearing up the sectarian nature of the constitution, where politics are based on one person, one vote, and it's not about your political allegiance.
It's very, very difficult to do because, they tinkered with the constitution at the end of the Civil War to form this Ta'if agreement. Not all elements of the Ta'if agreements have actually been enacted. But I mean, I don't think that the current political leadership of this country has what it takes, or the will indeed, to make these kind of changes to the constitution. Very, very difficult to do, even if there is a kind of a popular will in the country that things must change.
Yeah, and we haven't even discussed, powers like Hezbollah who are going to be opposed to it, and the sort of the international competing factions, Saudi Arabia versus Iran. They've all got their interests here, and they're not going to let that go. Leena, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I'm not running away, but I have to leave. So
thank you very much indeed. And I'm so glad
you'll answer all questions.
Yeah.
So out on the streets again, and look forward to the next one.
Yes, okay.
Unfortunately, I feel a bit like Nick. I'm not really sure that this will make change happen the way it's needed.
Yeah, that's a pessimistic scenario. Thank you very much, Leena. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye for now. Okay, let's take Lynn Maddock then. Lynn, do you want to go ahead? Just make sure your microphone's open. Look at the bottom left-hand side of your screen for the microphone button. There you go, Lynn. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nicholas. And I think both Nicholas and Leena have answered my question, which was, does the protest movement have the capacity to generate some leadership which can be effective in taking control, taking power?
But I'll just follow up that, Lynn, because I think it's a good question. So far, I think the opposition or the street movement has been fairly leaderless. Are there any sort of new young characters who are emerging that could lead an alternative political movement, Nick?
Not really. I mean, not as yet. The protest movement from its inception back in October deliberately remains leaderless. It's more of a kind of a linear network of activists. And they felt that, if someone was to step up to the front, it would be easier for the authorities to target them. At the moment, we've had some protests in the wake of the explosion last week. They've tended to turn violent. So, we had a big demonstration, I think it was on Saturday. So you had tens of thousands of people down in central Beirut. But there's always a periphery of these crowds that turn violent. They start picking up stones and sticks, tossing them at the police and army. The army responds with tear gas and rubber bullets. And the sort of the mild-mannered protesters, if you like, get put off by the violence and they go home and leave the streets to the security forces and the sort of youths with their stones and sticks. This isn't going to work.
So far, no signs. So far, it's a fairly basic street movement and nothing more. I mean, I know that there were, when in the 2018 elections, there were independent MPs or independent candidates put up, and only 2 managed to get elected, ultimately only 1. So in terms of providing an alternative leadership, it doesn't seem that there's much emerging.
That's right, and she resigned from Parliament last week.
Right.
So no independence left.
Okay, I think that answers that question then. Stuart Williams. Do you want to open your microphone? Just go, there you go, Stuart. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is described as an accident. And that sounded a bit too glib to me. There were, in fact, as I observed it, there were two explosions. There was a lesser explosion, and then there was the big explosion.
Nick, you're reasonably well qualified to this, knowing a bit about sort of military material and explosions. So I think you're well placed to answer this, Nick.
Well, I think the Lebanese are going to be debating this explosion for decades to come. An investigation is about to get underway. After a bit of political wrangling, the Lebanese decided on the name of a judge who's going to lead the investigation. We have an American envoy, David Hale, is in town, and yesterday he said the FBI would be helping. There are French investigators on the ground as well, forensic guys who've been diving into the harbour and scouting around for evidence. It's going to be a Lebanese investigation, though not international, although there have been a lot of calls amongst the Lebanese for international investigation, but the Lebanese authorities have ruled that out. Now, in terms of the chain of events that led to the Big Bang, it started off with a fire in one of the warehouses in the port. There is a very dramatic and tragic indeed video, one of many, of course, that were taken, but it shows all three sequences. So yeah, there was a young couple on a balcony 500 meters from ground zero filming the original fire and chit-chatting in the background. Then we see an explosion, which is the first explosion. And the woman is imploring her boyfriend, husband, friends, whoever he is, to come back inside. And then we see lots of little flashes inside the smoke, which are supposedly fireworks. Some people are claiming they might be small arms, munitions, mortar rounds, that kind of thing going off as well. And then suddenly we have the big explosion, and the shockwave hits the apartment where the couple were filming within a second. And I think that the guy died. I don't know about the woman. But these were the three events that happened. Now, there's been a lot of speculation, of course, that were the Israelis responsible. Some people heard what sounded like a jet engine of a sort of a diving Israeli jet just before the first smaller explosion. But other people are saying, well, this could have been the noise of the winds being sucked into the flames prior to the explosion. Others are claiming that it might have been rocket engines pointing perhaps at Hezbollah storing weapons in the port, and that some rocket engines caught fire, and this led to the first explosion, and that the first explosion then ignited in a neighboring warehouse the 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. So that's a sequence of events. There's a lot of misinformation going out there. People have been photoshopping missiles into video footage to suggest that the Israelis did it. My feeling is that this is not the Israelis, and it does seem to be an accident in its origins. To my mind, although I think it's clear that the ammonium nitrate caused the big bomb, the big explosion, what exactly was blowing up as part of the first explosion? Was it just fireworks, as the authorities say, or were there other munitions stored there? And if so, who did they belong to, and why were they there? There are a lot of questions to still be asked about this.
Stuart, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was. You stated right at the beginning that these were explosives destined for Mozambique. What I'd read previously is that this was fertilizer destined for Mozambique.
Yeah, fertilizer destined for Mozambique, which would be used for, I think, commercial explosive for mining.
Yeah, ammonium nitrate can be used as an explosive, but it can also be used for as fertilizer. But the ammonium nitrate, as I understand it, that was stored in Beirut port, was destined to be used as explosive and not as fertilizer.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, let's take Pete Morris next. You can bring Pete up. I just have to check. You have just to uncheck your microphone at the bottom left hand of the screen. Pete. A bit of problem there. Pete, have you got your microphone? If Pete can't get to his microphone, I'll ask the question for him. And he was basically as a good follow-up, really. It was what's Hezbollah been doing in response to the explosion? Have they been involved in any of this clean-up operation? What have they been doing politically, Nick?
Well, they're not on the ground in East Beirut. East Beirut is predominantly Christian, so there's no real base of support or activity of Hezbollah in the stricken areas of town. They have obviously a huge social welfare network of clinics and hospitals, and they've opened these all to treat casualties. Politically, they haven't said that much. Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, did give a speech in the aftermath of the explosion, basically to deny that Hezbollah had any activities at the port, that it wasn't bringing in any munitions or anything like that through the port. Nasrallah said that we in Hezbollah know more about the activities in the Israeli port of Haifa than we do in Beirut port. You know, some people believe that, other people don't believe it, but that's the stance that they've taken. They, like the other political leaders, have said that the explosion has to be investigated properly and thoroughly, and heads must roll, you know, the guilty parties and so on and so forth. But that's about the extent of Hezbollah's actions so far.
Okay, we've got a very interesting question from Ruth Campbell. Ruth, do you want to go on? Go ahead, Ruth.
Thank you. In Australia, at least, Macron's visit so early was reported as getting a lot of very positive response from the Lebanese, and there were pictures to that effect. I'm interested in your views about the significance of that. Is it an act of international leadership, or is it being recognised, and how much does that hark back to the affiliation with the good old days of French colonialism, or anything else?
Yeah, the Lebanese call France Mother France, and obviously the French have had influence here long before the post-World War I mandate, of course. So I think it was natural for Macron to come to Lebanon, Lebanon's time of need. There's obviously a domestic political aspect to all this as well. But France in general has been losing influence in Lebanon over the past 3-4 decades or so, with the Americans, the US becoming more influential. So people look more towards the US embassy today rather than the French embassy. So it was a popular move, certainly on the streets, for Macron to show up. As I said earlier, Lebanese politicians have been staying away because they don't want to get chased out of the neighborhoods by angry residents. So yeah, Macron was feted when he walked through the streets of Gymnase. There was even a petition going around about asking for France to come back as a mandate so that we don't have to live under the current Lebanese political leadership. And indeed, Macron is going to be back.
How many people signed that, and how much credence do you give it? I mean, I can't see.
No, it was. I mean, it was a gesture of frustration rather than, you know, a serious intent to bring Mother France back to Beirut. But Macron will be back here on September the 1st, which marks the centenary of Lebanon's existence, which is going to be a rather grim centenary. But there we are.
Okay, let's take two questions at the same time now. Let's take Diane Cook and Adrian Kassar. So Diane, I think your sort of question feeds into what we've been talking about already. But let's take your question and Adrian's back to back. So Diane, go ahead.
You can hear me okay?
Yep,
yes.
Go on.
Is unmuted. My question's prompted by a comment earlier from Leena that the slogans are polarizing, but maybe underneath there's agreement between the different sects and the different groups. And so my question really is, does Lebanon need a liberation movement that can transcend that and cut across sectarianism?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, and I don't want to be too cynical, but for me, there's no politics at the moment in Lebanon. The political leaders are essentially all looking after their own sort of shared parochial interests. They all have a shared interest in denying reforms that would lead to the weakening of their grip on the state. So it doesn't matter if you're, Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, or Nabi Berri, who's the head of the Amal movement. they would be in agreement essentially on this line, at any rate, with someone like Saad Hariri, who's the head of the movement and politically opposed to Hezbollah. Saying earlier on that, I mean, I think perhaps one of the only ways that the system can be changed here is if you have a mass protest movement, a nationwide protest movement that has to be coupled with very stern international pressure as well. This is what happened after the Hariri assassination in 2005, when the Syrians were in the country. 15,000 Syrian troops. Their intelligence services were very pervasive, and they were basically dominating the country. The Lebanese wanted them out because they blamed Syria for the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. But protests alone in downtown Beirut probably wouldn't have been enough. But the then Bush administration jumped on the back of the protest movement and put a lot of pressure on the Bashar al-Assad to pull his forces out of Syria. And the combination of the protest movement in Beirut plus international pressure led the Syrians to disengage from Lebanon. It's going to be even harder to disengage the current political leadership from the Lebanese state, but I think it will have to be that kind of combination of international pressure and domestic popular pressure to try to implement some kind of change.
And one mustn't forget the huge amount of money that Beirut owes to its international creditors. Mm-hmm. And I know you've emphasized, Nick, that this has failed to produce enough pressure to produce reform previously, but surely that leverage is still there. Let's bring in Adrian Kassar, because this sort of relates to this. Adrian, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thanks, Nick. This question relates to the relationships between Lebanon and its regional neighbouring states, and I wondered if as the aid package matures, whether different nation states are going to have competing offers, and how that might affect the future for Lebanon. Taking up on Nicholas's last point, I wonder if there's going to be any freedom for people to express the shape of what should be accepted for Lebanon in that protest movement. So it's a question about relations with neighbouring states and how internally that might go down. The aid package might go down.
Well, on the freedom front, I mean, there's plenty of expression of freedom on social media, out on the streets. A lot of the activists in the protest movement are coming up with different ideas, trying to take this seriously, about coming up with alternative systems to the one that we have now. But of course, it's implementing all this that's the difficult part. In terms of the regional relationship, in the past, traditionally, Lebanon looks to the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE, and so on, for assistance at times of need. But the situation today is that the Saudis have kind of washed their hands of Lebanon somewhat. They feel that Lebanon has drifted too far into Iran's orbit, and that it's not the friendly little state in the Mediterranean that it used to be, which is why I think the Lebanese would love it if the regional countries were competing with each other to see who could donate more. But at the moment, the Iranians have stepped in to offer some kind of aid. But Iran obviously has its own financial problems, so it's unclear what they will offer and how much of it. But apart from some emergency assistance for the Beirut explosion from the Gulf has shown very little will to step in to help Lebanon out of its deeper economic and political morass.
Yeah, I think it's also worth possibly re-emphasizing, Nick, the role of Hezbollah as well, and the dominance it has within Lebanese politics, and that it's not going to go away soon either. Some people may not be familiar with the talks you've given to us previously on that. So maybe you could just say a bit about the state within a state that is Hezbollah. Yeah,
well, I mean, Hezbollah has emerged as the most powerful political entity in Lebanon. It's a very strong regional military force, helping Iran project power across the region. The Hezbollah's fighters, of course, have fought in Syria and the civil war there. They fought against ISIS in Iraq. They're fighting against the Saudis, indeed, in Yemen, helping the Houthis, training them up and helping them fire missiles into Saudi Arabia. So obviously it's a very powerful organization now, and they were the main backers of the government that's just resigned. But at the same time, Hezbollah has never faced such an array of challenges as well. So it's almost grown too big for its own good. When I started covering these guys in the mid-1990s, they numbered maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people. They were very focused on fighting the then Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. They had a small parliamentary presence, but didn't need any more. They weren't really interested in getting involved in Lebanese politics. Since then, particularly from 2000, when the Israelis pulled out of South Lebanon, Hezbollah has grown. I mean, we're now talking maybe 30,000 full-time fighters. We could probably call upon another 20,000 part-timers. They're in governments. They, as I said, they dominated or backed the current government. They've become corrupt. There's a lot of internal corruption, which was unheard of 20 or so years ago. Back then, they had a reputation for clean hands, but now it's this massive, bloated, bureaucratic system that's allowed corruption to fester. I think popularity is not what it was within the Shia community. People feel the weight of Hezbollah on their shoulders these days. And when the protest movement kicked off in October, you had people in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is very much controlled by Hezbollah. They were coming out in protests against Hezbollah. They were drinking beer on the streets, which is unthinkable in Hezbollah areas. So the Hezbollah's grip on the population is not what it was. So they're in a rather paradoxical position of being very powerful on the one hand, but having all these challenges on the other.
This is a mind-boggling mix that we've been dealing with here. We've been talking about the explosion. We've talked about the protest movement in the past year or so. We've talked about the failure of the government overall to govern. We've talked about the sectarian divide. It seems as though Lebanon can limp from one crisis to the next, and then nothing seemingly happens. You know, you have a terrible explosion, you have massive street protests, but still the situation remains the same. Marty, Ryan, you've got a really good question. So we need to do some sort of crystal ball gazing if possible. Marty, go ahead.
Yes, given what you said about the sort of impossibility of changing the government structure and all of these competing factions, the words you used earlier were Lebanon will go into the abyss. So what do you see as the future?
A big black hole, to be honest. I mean, everyone knows what needs to be done, these economic and fiscal reforms. We had the French foreign minister was in Lebanon at the end of July, and you could almost hear the exasperation in his voice saying, look, we want to help you guys, but you have to help yourself first before we can help you. And he said, you know, everyone knows what needs to be done. Just go ahead and do it. But they can't do it. They can't, the political leadership here can't bring themselves to implement reforms that will lead potentially to their downfall down the road. And this is a tragedy of Lebanon. So I think what we're going to see, we're already seeing it, is rising crime. I don't see a civil war along the 1975 lines because there's only one super militia in the country. People have got weapons individually, but there are no other militias to tackle Hezbollah. But I do see an increase in lawlessness, an increase in crime, which we're already seeing in some areas. And we're going to see continued emigration. People are now thinking the country's lost. There's no future for us here, and they're leaving. You have university graduates. We've got some of the top universities in the region in Beirut. And you have these highly qualified young people graduating from university with absolutely zero prospects of worthwhile. And so it's the brain drain. I mean, Lebanon's been known for this for centuries, really. But these folks are just packing their bags and leaving. And I know lots of people who are quitting Beirut, Lebanese and foreigners as well, because they simply see no future in the country. So, you know, I try to be an optimist by nature, but it's very, very hard to be optimistic about the future of this country.
Nick, you mentioned the Bush administration making a big difference after the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. if there was a change in the US administration and you found there was a more assertive White House, a more assertive US foreign policy, could that tip the balance of scales?
I don't see much change in the US position towards Lebanon. Trump isn't leading, policy towards Lebanon. It's part of the bureaucracy of the system in the United States, the State Department, the Pentagon. There's a lot of support by the Americans for the Lebanese army, which should continue. The Lebanese army is the one state institution that can help try to keep things together. It's great. If the Americans pull the plug on funding for the army and the army disintegrates, Lebanon really is going to be in big trouble. So I don't really think there's going to be an awful lot of difference. If Biden replaces Trump, I think things will probably jog along much the same.
Right. Let's see if I'm trying to and bring in some other questions here. Simon Jackson, or if I think it's Annie McMahon. Annie McMahon.
Hello. I was just out of curiosity, it's kind of personal interest, because we used to do business with Saudi, and I had the opportunity to meet both Rafiq and Saad Hariri in 2004. I'm curious, you've given a good overview about how political leadership in general is perceived, but I'm curious to know specifically how Saad is seen and how his father's legacy is seen today.
Yeah, good question. Well, I think his father's legacy has waned over the years. I mean, it's been 15 years, of course, since he was killed. So next week we've got the verdict in this long-running trial in the Netherlands, where 5 Hezbollah members were accused of participation in the assassination of Hariri. To a certain extent, that will bring things to a close, I think, in terms of the Rafiq Hariri legacy. In terms of Saad is not his father. He's always struggled a little bit, I think. Obviously, there was a lot of sympathy for him initially when he entered politics, replacing his father. But he's seen a little bit, I think, as a weak figure. He's never really got to grips as a kind of a Sunni representative of the Sunni community. He has a base of support, but it has been waning. He's had financial problems himself with his business. And that has also affected his popularity. So a lot of these politicians maintain.
We've lost Nick slightly there, but I'm sure he'll come back again. And if there's a problem, we can always get him by phone as well. Let's just see how you're doing. If Nick is still there, let's bring in Nick. We lost you there for a bit. Just go with what you've been saying for the last 20 seconds. Go on. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I was just saying that Saad's popularity has declined, partly because of his financial fortunes. He hasn't been able to dispense money in the same manner as in the past to maintain his popularity. He was prime minister until December, which gave him a degree of popularity in the sense that people have to pay attention to what a Lebanese prime minister says. And that may be the case if he comes back as prime minister in the next government. But essentially, the Hariri legacy has declined. A lot of people now, of course, blaming Rafiq Hariri for starting the process that got Lebanon into this mess by borrowing heavily on international markets in the 1990s to fund the then post-Civil War reconstruction effort. We're $80 billion or so in debt at the moment, and that some of that is down to Rafiq Hariri, not entirely though.
Let's bring us. We've got quite a few more questions to sort of try and rattle through. Aldo Sauda. I don't know if I pronounced your surname correctly, Aldo. Are you there, Aldo? Hello, I can see you.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Go ahead with your question.
Now my question is about China. We read a lot of here that China will help Lebanon rebuild the port. Is it possible?
Well,
is there a real chance that China replace America or France
as
yeah,
a
it's a
power broker? Go on, Nick.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Nasrallah, the Hezbollah's leader, has been saying, look, we need to look east, not west, to get out of our financial mess. We need to look to Iran, to the Russians, to the Chinese in particular. The Chinese have been eyeing up Lebanon for some time as part of its Silk Road project to expand influence and business contacts across Asia and Africa. And they have been, the Chinese company, I believe.
Hang on 1 second. Just sort the sound.
There's a bit of an echo. So Mike.
Go on, sorry, Nick.
So, yeah, okay. So, anyway, his company a couple of months ago put in an offer to help build 3 power stations along the Lebanese coast. The Chinese have also been looking at Lebanon as a potential staging ground for commercial forays into neighboring Syria, especially if and when the Syria reconstruction project begins, as things calm down in that country. And Lebanon, with its ports, or at least, had a big port in Beirut, not quite the same as before, but there is a port in Tripoli, which is quite close to the Syrian border. And there's a lot of speculation the Chinese will set up shop in Lebanon and use Lebanon as a base for commercial operations in Syria. So we'll see. But a lot of people are looking at China at the moment here.
Okay, let's bring Philip Godfrey in, if we can, and then Pamela Dixon, please. So Philip Godfrey, immediately followed by Pamela. Philip.
Nicholas, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, clearly gone.
Yeah,
I can. Yes.
Nicholas B, hello there, hi. I think you've partly answered this question, but for clarity, you've talked about Lebanon descending into the abyss and the lack of opportunity for an up-and-coming younger leadership to take some control. A lot of the ingredients, economic and otherwise, that you have put forward would be ripe for being exploited by the armed forces, possibly undemocratic coup d'etat. What is the Lebanese armed forces position? Who controls them? And are they an undemocratic, not solution, but answer to the abyss question?
That's a good question too. A lot of people have been quietly muttering that they would like to see the army commander, General Joseph Aoun, become a kind of a temporary leader of the country, sort of a soft martial law. Lebanon has never had a coup, a military coup. The army constitutionally answers to the president. And I think probably the nearest, we've had a lot of presidents who were previously army commanders. It's almost become a kind of a stopgap job, becoming army commander, and then you become president. The army commander, like the presidency, is always drawn from the Maronite sect. I don't see a coup attempt happening for a number of reasons, but probably the biggest reason, excuse me, is that Hezbollah wouldn't permit it. Yeah. And it would take a very ballsy army commander to decide, right, I'm taking charge against Hezbollah's objections. So I don't see that happening.
And Nick,
the army, I think,
to emphasize here, isn't it, is that most Lebanese have a tremendous fear of civil war. And Hezbollah itself, too, doesn't want to push its power so much so that it engages in active conflict with other bodies within Lebanon. It's what you talk about, this idea of consensus, forced consensus.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Lebanese army is the one state institution that broadly wins respect from all Lebanese. And the Lebanese remember the 2 worst periods of the civil war around 76, 77 and 1984 came after the army collapsed twice during the civil war. So there's a kind of unspoken agreement amongst Lebanese that the army needs to be, fully functioning, doing its job and respected and not harmed in any way. But I don't see the army taking advantage of this to mount some kind of coup. I don't think that's
Pamela Dixon, let's bring in Pamela. Pamela, you just need to undo your microphone just to open it up. Pamela, you there?
Okay. Yeah, I was curious about this, talking about Hezbollah and thinking about the fact that they really started around the time of the great conflict with Israel. And now that Israel has this sort of a cooperation agreement with the UAE, which was announced yesterday, do you foresee any shifting, change in the balance of power in the sense of, will there still be such a need for Hezbollah defending against Israel if Israel and another Arab state are starting to cooperate with each other?
Well, Hezbollah answers to the orders of a non-Arab state, and that's Iran. And of course, Iran and Hezbollah will not view with favor the arrangement, this new arrangement between the UAE and Israel. I haven't heard any reaction yet from Hezbollah about it, but it's certainly going to be negative, and I'm sure will be talked about in Nasrallah's next speech. But it's. They used to say that, the Israelis used to say back in the 50s, we don't know which Arab country will make peace with first, but we know that the second one would be Lebanon. So there was always a feeling that Lebanon wasn't really part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The mercantile nature of the Lebanese, it was all about deals and making a profit, and that they couldn't, being a small, weak country, they couldn't be the first to make peace with Israel, but once that taboo had been broken by some country, that Lebanon would jump in and be the second. Now, of course, that didn't turn out. And the rate things are going, Lebanon will probably be the last Arab country to make peace with Israel. And that's largely because of Hezbollah and Hezbollah's strong anti-Israel stance, which has remained unchanged.
I think we've got time just for one more question. Sorry, does that answer your question, Pamela? Was that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. One more question from Anna Logan, and I think we're going to be wrapping it up. Anna.
Thank you, Nicholas. What does Lebanon actually produce that the world will buy?
Expats, basically. I mean, the Lebanese don't really produce anything. It's not an industrial nation. It's a services-oriented economy. So it's good with its was good with its financial institutions, hotels, restaurants, tourism, this kind of thing. The Bekaa Valley, used to be known in the Roman era as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. And fruit and vegetables and hashish is still grown in the Bekaa, but that's mainly for domestic consumptions or exports down to the Gulf. But it's not an industrial. I suppose the best export of Lebanon, literally is the Lebanese. They grow up here, they have a good education, and off they go, and invariably they thrive wherever they end up, whether it's in West Africa to become millionaire merchants or brain surgeons in the United States and Paris, whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's not an industrial company, so it's the Lebanese themselves are probably Lebanon's greatest export.
Nick, we've had a huge number of questions here. It's been a really, really good discussion. Do you think there's anything we've missed out? I'm just thinking back over what we've been talking about. I mean, do you have a sense of what's going to happen over the next week or so? I mean, are people sort of tentatively, can you see the government moving any particular direction with the talk about Hariri? Are there any other aspects we haven't covered as well?
Well, I think you've hit all the markers on this one. It's been pretty comprehensive. There's a lot of pressure on the Lebanese to form a new government quickly for obvious reasons. Very often, the governments, it can take literally months sometimes for the various politicians to agree on who's going to be the head of government and who's going to get what cabinet seat. But I would imagine they're going to be quite quick this time because the world is watching. But if you do have more questions to ask, I'd be happy to answer them by email. If you wanted to, Nick, if you wanted to collectively send me a bunch of questions, and I'll send the answers back to you, and you can pass them on if you like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we very much hope that Beirut is going to rebuild itself quickly. We've got a long history of traveling with you and exploring the place, looking at the politics of Lebanon, and I hope that will continue to be the case and that we can possibly be there again in the spring of next year, fingers crossed. My thanks to you, Nick, also to Leena, who's now back at work. It's been a really, really good discussion. Thank you both very much indeed.